interested?
Yeah.
I can record it right now, I guess.
So, press start.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's fantastic to see everybody here. Welcome to Ethics in the Public Sphere. This series, many of you know, was established in 2012 and as a forum to bring to light the discussions and debates where ethics and public life intersect. And today we have the perfect speaker to do just this for us. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jennifer Morton. She's a Presidential Penn Compact Associate Professor of Philosophy with a secondary appointment at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. In this academic year, she's a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, where she's completing a book project related to today's talk, and that's forthcoming from Oxford University Press. She's also working on a project now focused on the implications of increasing precarity in various dimensions of people's lives, and explaining why stability is something to be valued. Professor Morton has an important and influential body of work on how poverty and social class shape our agency, and I was trying to identify just a small sampling of her amazing work to mention here, and I realized, maybe if I just confine myself to her prize-winning papers and books, that will do it, and even then it's going to be hard, but I'll give it a try. So Professor Morton is the author of the excellent book, Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility, published by Princeton University Press, winner of multiple book prizes, and also selected as the President's pre-read book for incoming Princeton students in 2025. She's also the winner of the inaugural Israel Scheffler Prize in the Philosophy of Education for a connected set of essays that includes papers such as Cultural Code Switching, Straddling the Achievement Gap, and The Educator's Dual Role, Expressing Ideals While Educating in Non-Ideal Conditions. As the prize committee reported, Morton's approach is interesting philosophically, crosses over into political theory and political science, and speaks to problems and concerns that are recognizable by everyday teachers and students. Her paper, Reasoning Under Scarcity, received the Australian Association of Philosophy Award for the best paper in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, and connected also with today's talk, her co-authored paper with Sarah Paul, Grit, a wonderful paper published in Ethics, was selected by the Philosopher's Annual as one of the 10 best philosophy papers in 2019. Professor Morton also admirably engages in public philosophy on related topics, and I believe her most recent written contribution in this area is an op-ed in the LA Times just from a few weeks ago on the deep problems with the college tuition system in the United States. So, with all that, we are simply delighted to have her here to share her thoughts on true grit, striving in the face of adversity. And just to let you know how this is going to go, Professor Morton will speak for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have a 10-minute break. There will be things to munch on and drinks. And then we'll come back for the Q&A. Okay. All right. So okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dana, for having me, and thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be at UCSD, and I unintentionally wore school colors, I realize, so happy about that. Okay, so let's get started. This is a project, a co-authored book with Sarah Paul at NYU Abu Dhabi, and we've been working on a connected set of ideas for a few years now, and what you're going to get is kind of a sample of some of the main claims that we're making, and this is geared towards a public audience. Of course, if you want to dig into some of the philosophical details in Q&A, happy to do that. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to set the scene by giving you some flavor of the kinds of cases that we're thinking about, the kinds of examples that we have in mind. So here you see at the top left, Diana Nyad, who completed a swim from Florida to Cuba at the age of 64 on her 5th attempt. And if some of you, I'm curious, how many of you have seen the movie on Netflix? Okay, a few hands. Great. So, it is a story of striving and perseverance of someone who, when she was in her 20s, wasn't able to complete the swim, and then had the audacity at age 64 to try it out, and finally succeeds. And I know there's a lot of controversy if you go dig deep into the story about whether she really succeeded in doing that. We're about that in Q&A. But we're going to take the broad outlines of the view of the story on board for today. On the top right corner, you see Tara Westover, who became well known for her memoir, Educated. Some of you might have read it. It's a wonderful novel. And it's the story of how she grew up in this fundamentalist Mormon household that didn't believe in public education, or actually much in the way of public goods. They didn't go to the doctor, they didn't go to school, they were homeschooled. And how she finds her way to pursuing higher education, ends up at Cambridge and Harvard and writing this best-selling memoir. And a lot of it is about the kind of sacrifices that she makes in the pursuit of education. At the bottom right, we have Sonia Sotomayor, and the kind of inspiring story, if you read her memoir, of how this young Latina grows up in the Bronx and becomes the first person in her family to go to college, to Princeton, and then receives a law degree from Yale, and now sits on the Supreme Court. Also a kind of wonderful story of grit and perseverance and overcoming adversity. And so these are examples of that kind of individuals striving in the face of great odds and accomplishing an ambitious goal. The fourth example that we talk about in the book, because we don't think striving and grit applies only to individual pursuits, sometimes it applies to relationships. So we have the example of marriage, right? And marriage can be the kind of relationship where you think there's also challenges to overcome, setbacks. Sometimes it feels like you're fighting against the odds, right? So the odds in marriage notoriously are not great, depending on your perspective. And it can take grit and perseverance to continue, sorry, that's a little, okay, to stay married. So relationships can also be the kinds of things that we strive to succeed at, and we wanted to make sure to have that as a potential case. Okay, so all of these cases should kind of get you in the spirit of thinking about what grit and striving are about. And the way that we think about it is that when we're striving, we're reaching for goals where success is not assured. So I do not strive to go to the grocery store every day. Some days it might feel really hard when my 7-year-old's sort of, kind of having a bad day. But in general, going to the grocery store is something that I'm pretty sure I can successfully accomplish. Landing on the Supreme Court, swimming from Florida to Cuba, becoming the first person in your family to go to college, succeeding at marriage. These are the kind of goals where you're not sure if you will succeed. And another feature of striving goals is that you encounter setbacks and challenges along the way. And when you encounter these setbacks and challenges, there is a question that arises for any striving agent. And this is the central question that we explore in the book. The question is, should I persevere? If you give up, you won't achieve this potentially transformative goal, and there's a lot in our culture that tells us to never give up, keep going and persevering. But if we persevere and fail, we often risk paying steep opportunity costs. There might be other things we could have spent our time pursuing, and if you the examples that I had before were of successful can also think of cases in which people have tried for a goal and failed, and thereby feel like they should have been doing something else. So we're kind of mindful that there are two potential options when we're striving. And let's see, let's see how we're thinking about that. Okay. So there's a way of thinking about setbacks or challenges that one encounters in the pursuit of difficult goals that is very influential in the literature, in both in psychology and philosophy. And this is the model of strength of will influenced by the paradigm of the dieter, the drinker, the smoker. Right? So in philosophy, these questions abound, or these examples abound. And on this picture, the greatest threat to our agency comes from temptation, the appeal of the momentary pleasure. And what strength of will consists in is resisting temptation. So the dieter who's looking at the delicious slice of chocolate cake, the smoker who's tempted to have one less smoke, or the drinker who wants a second drink, what strength of will involves in those cases is resisting the appeal of the momentary pleasure in order to stay on track with our goals. We want to reject this as a good paradigm for thinking about cases of striving. So though temptation and procrastination can often distract us from the pursuit of difficult long-term goals, it is not one of the main challenges that striving agents face. And by thinking more clearly about the kind of challenges that striving agents face, we think we can get a different picture of strength of will that the striving agent needs. Is this a no? Kind of like,
Yeah. Can you hold this?
or maybe if I could make it further away, will that work? Can people still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with it. Okay. Okay. So the way that we organize the book is by starting, and this is something we've got in part from Michael Franklin. Shout out to McDonald from Crackback. Is let's start by thinking about the kind of challenges that the striving agent faces, the kind of problems that we're trying to solve, and work backwards from there to think about what grit and perseverance look like. Okay, so what are the kind of problems that the striving agent faces? The first one that we talk about is what we call the road not taken. So when we set out to pursue a difficult long-term goal, often we consider alternatives. So for example, for Tara Westover, who becomes the first person in her family to go to college, she sees that her siblings stay in their community. They stay close to home, they have these relationships with their parents, they're part of this extended network of kin that has a lot of value in it. And so an alternative that is constantly in her mind is that she could have also stayed home with her family. Rather than pursuing education and moving away. Or, you might think of Sonia Sotomayor, who ended up sleeping in the Supreme Court. Perhaps she could have just stayed at her nice, cushy corporate job where she was making good money, right? Instead of pursuing this highly political path as she did, and there might be things that she would have gained from that. She could have been making good money and also not have people speculating about whether she should retire in the morning paper, right? And with relationships like marriage and devoted friendships, you might think there are always other people who it could be with instead. And you might ask yourself, like, should I really have committed to this person? Maybe there could have been alternatives. Don't recommend sharing that with your spouse. It's something you're thinking about. So one of the problems that the striving agent faces when a challenge or a setback arises is that it's tempting to revisit the alternatives. To think, maybe I should have gone for that other thing, right? And many of us are familiar. When I was pursuing my PhD in philosophy, I often thought, maybe I should have done law school, as many philosophy PhD students wonder, right? Once you're faced with like the rejection or the negative comments from a faculty member, you're like, maybe I could have gone for one of these alternatives. And one of the problems that the striving agent confronts is that when they're reconsidering the alternatives, that reconsideration can be destabilizing to your commitment. You might really wonder whether you should have done something else. Okay. Relatedly, there's another version. So in the first version of the problem, you're wondering, should I have gone for an alternative? In the second version of the problem, the risk is losing confidence. So when you embark on the pursuit of a difficult long-term goal, you have a sense of the value that you're pursuing, of the value that attaches to success, and a belief about how likely you are to achieve that goal. Usually the agent believes that success is likely enough and the value of the goal compared to the alternatives good enough to merit the pursuit. Otherwise, you wouldn't be pursuing that difficult long-term goal. The problem that the striving agent faces when they confront a setback or challenge is that the setback or challenge can easily be seen as evidence that maybe you don't have what it takes to succeed, or that the context won't offer you the opportunity to do so. Or maybe in general that you're just not going to succeed even if you continue to try. And if it's true that continued effort is unlikely to pay off, then it does make sense to quit and pursue a different opportunity, right? And so the question that the striving agent faces is, what is this setback as evidence that I won't succeed? And that can be quite destabilizing in of itself, because you're spending a lot of time, right? So if those of you who have pursued graduate degrees and worried about the possibility that you won't succeed, might think, I spent all this time and effort, right? These classes, I could have been making money, but now I have this graduate stipend. Sorry, I shouldn't even for the graduate students. Then you think, oh no, what if this doesn't turn out well? So that is another problem that the striving agent faces. In some other work, I've talked about pessimism traps, and this is something that particularly might come up for agents who are from marginalized groups. So in deciding to embark on a new goal, agents generally try to get a sense of whether the goal is within reach based on their beliefs about the context in their own agency. You don't want to waste months or years of your life in a new pursuit, if they're valuable alternatives. But one of the things that we do to figure out what our chances are of success are look around for models of how others have achieved the goal we're after. And we pay attention to stories of success and failures to kind of get a sense of how likely we're to succeed. This kind of inquiry helps us guard against quixotic projects, but it also raises challenges, in particular for agents who might have been historically marginalized or underrepresented in some pursuits. I might look around to see whether people like me have achieved this goal and find little evidence that they have. Raj Chetty, the economist at Harvard, and Alex Bell have this interesting paper on innovation that kind of helps bolster this point. So what they do is they look at children who have been exposed to innovators, people that patented new technologies growing up, and find that, like, as you might expect, if you grow up around innovators, you're more likely to become an innovator yourself. And it's like, duh, right? Like, that makes sense. But the interesting thing that they find is that young girls are more likely to innovate if they're surrounded by and have grown up around women innovators, but not male innovators. So it seems like the young girls that then become women innovators are not looking around just for evidence of, like, do people innovate, or how can I pursue this path to being an inventor or someone that trademarks a new technology, but do women in particular pursue this path? And presumably that influences whether they end up pursuing that goal. And so you might worry that if you're a person from a marginalized group thinking about pursuing a very difficult, challenging goal in a particular field, and you see that not a lot of people like you have ended up achieving, that might discourage you because you don't see models of how you get there. So and the worry about the pessimism traps is that, as you might imagine, if members from marginalized groups are discouraged from pursuing a particular goal or a particular field because they don't see members like themselves pursuing that goal, then there are not going to be other people in that field, right? It's going to end up pushing out members of marginalized groups, and that can have this kind of snowball effect. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A. Okay. The final challenge that we think striving agents face is kind of the opposite of the three that we've talked about. It's not about being too willing to give up on a goal, perhaps, or too easily discouraged. It's the opposite, which is when you have committed and now you're like, no, I am not the kind of person that gives up. Even as the evidence starts to accumulate that, like, maybe you should give up. So the challenges we've looked at so far are threats to our ability to embark on a difficult pursuit and to persevere in the face of evidence that it isn't going well. And that might suggest that all we need to be able to do is get going and hang on. But the problem is not always that we quit too early or too easily. We can also be vulnerable to the problem of commitment escalation, at which evidence of failure leads us to double down and invest more in a failing project. And you can look at this with, there's some classic examples of kind of failed businesses or products, but I think also sticking it out long enough in a clearly miserable relationship or career. Home renovations that become money pits, or even trivial examples like waiting for the bus longer than it would have taken to walk. And the case of Diana Naya is an interesting one because she does succeed in the end, but one of the things that comes out in the movie is that she seems to sacrifice so much in terms of her personal relationships and the other things going on in her life to succeed in this goal that you kind of wonder whether it's worth it, right? So you're so focused on really succeeding and like not giving up that even when it would make sense to give up, you don't give up. Okay, so those are the sort of challenges that we're thinking about. So the four threats to striving we have discussed, that we're not taken, losing confidence, pessimism traps, and commitment escalation show us some common challenges confronted by striving agents. Notice that the temptation to quit in these cases really rarely comes from the appeal of temporary pleasure, but from confronting the difficulty of the pursuit and wondering whether another valuable alternative might have been a better bet. Or on the flip side, we can exhibit a kind of weakness of will by not being able to bring ourselves to quit when we should. So some of the challenges that the striving agent has to overcome arise at critical junctures, where she confronts setbacks that seem potentially like good evidence that she's wasting her time. And you might think, well, maybe the solution is something like optimism or hope. And so we're going to turn to consider that now. And as you can tell by the picture, we're not totally going to know about this option. Okay. Given the challenges faced by the striving agent, it might seem like being optimistic in the face of setbacks and challenges would be the solution. And Morton Seligman, the kind of father of positive psychology, my colleague at Penn, suggests that optimists do better on a variety of measures. They're healthier, they live longer, they're more likely to be married. And in fact, I gave an earlier version of this talk, and Seligman was in the audience, and he was just like, why shouldn't we just always be optimistic? Very on brand. But other researchers, such as Angela Duckworth, have thought of optimism as part and parcel of grit. That believing in yourself, believing that you will succeed, is how we get to stay motivated and stay committed. And the appeal is undeniable. If you think that you're going to fail, then in all likelihood you will, because you're going to quit. And so, kind of makes sense. But optimism opens up potential high costs. Optimists will only pay attention to positive evidence or who ignore evidence altogether might be able to sustain their positive assessment of success, but at the cost of risking failure in cases in which failure might be very expensive from the agency's perspective. Sometimes the evidences give us good information that we should pay attention to and quit. Gabrielle Oettingen, a psychologist at NYU, has done research on this, on the importance of anticipating challenges and setbacks. And she's found that she's compared two groups. Some who are just kind of optimistic about their chances of success, and another group that has a kind of more moderated optimism. In fact, what they do is they anticipate the setbacks and challenges that they will face and think through how they would respond to those potential setbacks or challenges. And she finds that people who are just optimistic end up doing worse than those who vividly picture the contrast between where they currently are and where they need to be, and the obstacles that stand in their way. So simply ignoring evidence or only paying attention to the positive evidence, we think is quite risky and makes kind of unbridled optimism not an appealing solution for the striving agent. So what's the solution that we propose? So I think it's helpful to kind of take a step back and think about the kind of dilemma that the striving agent faces. On the one hand, what you want to avoid is premature despair, right? So you don't want to be the person that at the first setback or challenge is immediately like, nope, can't do it, I'm going to fail, let me think of something else. So you don't want to be too easily discouraged by a setback or a challenge that you confront. But you also want to avoid expensive failure, right? So you don't want to be the person who keeps going and keeps investing and doubling down on some goal just because you don't want to be a quitter, or just because you're like committed to being gritty, when in fact there might have been an alternative that you should have considered and switched to, or it maybe just makes sense to quit this endeavor. And so that's the kind of, what the striving agent is trying to do is find a middle ground, which we label rationally permissible optimism. And we think of this as a kind of epistemic resilience. So an agent is epistemically resilient when they're paying attention to evidence concerning their likelihood of success, given their context and abilities, the value of the end they're pursuing, and the value of the alternatives. However, to counteract premature despair, they're slower to change their minds in the face of negative evidence when it's rationally permissible to do so. And so I'm going to kind of unpack that a little bit, because I know it's a little bit of philosophy terminology there. So in many cases, when we're forming beliefs, the evidence is clear. It's a beautiful, sunny Southern California day today. The evidence is clear. We can all look out the window. I'm standing in a room at UCSD. But again, we have pretty good evidence about that. But in some cases, the evidence seems to under-determine what we should believe. In particular, when it comes to the future, and to a future that depends on our agency. So suppose that you decide to open up a restaurant. You have experience as a chef at a well-known restaurant in your city. You think you have something to contribute and you know the business well. Will your restaurant business succeed? The evidence might not be clear to you, right? At that time you say, it's a good environment for restaurants, maybe post-pandemic people are going out to eat a lot, but the competition is tough. Maybe your restaurant is in Philadelphia, great food in Philadelphia, highly recommend. So you have a lot of competition, you have the right kind of kitchen experience, but maybe you've never run a business. Seems like the evidence really could go either way. In such cases, reasonable people looking at the same evidence could disagree about whether you will succeed or not. Those are the cases that we think of as within the rationally permissible threshold, as cases of underdetermination. And the thought that we have is that the epistemically resilient agent is the one that in situations like that, where the evidence could go either way, is more optimistic rather than not. So if you could be more optimistic rather than not, you take the optimistic path. However, that mechanism doesn't allow you to be optimistic if the evidence is clearly on the negative side, right? So suppose that you start a restaurant business, the evidence isn't clear cut, you think, oh, maybe I'll succeed, I'm gonna be optimistic. And then the pandemic hits, right? And you know you don't have enough in the bank to make it through whatever this might bring, right? It might be that in that kind of case, given that you're a new restaurant just starting out and you don't have a lot saved up, the evidence is pretty clear. You're just gonna have to quit and like deal with your losses, right? So in that case, there might not be this kind of underdetermination that there is in the first case I was talking about. So we kind of exploit this idea of underdetermination basically to get you a kind of optimism that is not the optimism of the person who only looks at the positive evidence or ignores the evidence just to be optimistic no matter what, but the person who's optimistically looking at the evidence, which we think is different. Happy to talk about that more in Q&A. Now, a critical part of our project is to think about a striving agent as not just being someone who's interested in, who's not just interested in kind of success come what may, but is someone that's paying attention to the evidence and is on the lookout for situations in which quitting is reasonable. And what we're thinking is that when we pursue difficult long-term goals, we're not just focused on success, we're also engaged in inquiry. We want to know how conducive the context is to our success, what we're capable of, what success will ultimately look like. Shutting our eyes to evidence is to shut out this important dimension of striving. And we think that one of the interesting things about this kind of agency, striving agency, is that because you're not certain if you're going to succeed, part of what you're doing in pursuing the goal is finding out, right? Part of what you're doing in pursuing this difficult long-term goal is finding out whether you are the kind of person that can succeed at this. Can you actually swim from Florida to Cuba, right? That is kind of like part of what's driving that in our head, not just like doing it, but kind of finding out whether she can do it. And so inquiry is as critical a part to this endeavor as the actual pursuit of the goal. And we think that once we have this view on board, there's some interesting dimensions of the pursuit of difficult long-term goals that emerge. Okay, so now I'm going to switch a little bit to another part of the book that we're exploring. So a critical part of the picture that we have is that when you're pursuing a difficult long-term goal, part of what you're doing is looking at the evidence and trying to figure out what it's telling you about how likely you are to succeed, what your agency is going to look like. And often we interpret the evidence based on interpretive frameworks that we're bringing. Are you an optimistic person? Maybe someone that thinks in terms of structures and thinks about the social structure through embedded in institutions. Maybe you're more of an individualist. These frameworks might lead you to look at the evidence in different ways. Often the interpretive framework we use might be a matter of habit, upbringing, and the like, but this doesn't mean that our frameworks cannot be challenged or changed. The people around us, teachers, mentors, friends, coaches, can help us see the evidence in a new light. They can push us to reconsider whether we're being too negative or too optimistic. So I'm a pessimist by nature. I tend to, at the first sign of like any, a rejection for a paper. I'm like, oh, this paper sucks, and like, I should just quit doing philosophy. That is my tendency. But I'm very fortunate that I married an optimist. I highly recommend if you're a pessimist or you're an optimist. And one of the wonderful things about marrying an optimist is having this other perspective that tempers my own tendency to be pessimistic about my assessment of the evidence. So my husband Jason will often point out that I'm ignoring all this positive evidence, right? I'm not really paying attention to the full spectrum of evidence when I'm engaged in this pessimistic thinking. The challenge or the setback is looming very large. And so what the the optimist can do for you is help you recalibrate. And I think this is often what we do for each other. So those of us who teach know this well, right? In both directions. So sometimes a student comes to you and they're being overly negative about their ability or their capacity. And part of what you do is try to point them to a more optimistic interpretation of their own skills and abilities. Sometimes students are like overly optimistic. And then part of what you do is try to provide a critical lens, right? So other people, we think, are really critically important to this process of trying to figure out whether the goal makes sense, whether you should quit or not. And we think that thinking about this dimension of inquiry can help us see that in a way that might not be immediately obvious if we just think about the pursuit of the goal without thinking about evidence in this epistemic dimension. Okay. Here's an example from a classic sociology text, J. McLeod, Ain't No Making It. Some of you might have read it if you're taking an intro to sociology class. It's an interesting book in which J. McLeod looks at a housing project, a low-income housing project in Boston, and what he's examining is the dynamics of two groups that live in this project. One group he calls the hallway hangers. They're mostly white, low-income kids involved in criminal activity, drugs, drinking. They tend to be dropouts or not attend school a lot. They're hanging out in the hallways. The name he gives the group implies. And another he calls the brothers. They're mostly black, low-income kids. They're all living in the same housing project, but they're kind of from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. And the brothers rarely drink or do drugs. They go to school, they play sports, and they have very high aspirations for their educational and career trajectories. And he has this chapter on which he compares the aspiration of the two groups, and what J. McLeod is interested in is the fact that these two groups of kids are basically living in the same place, right? They're confronting similar setbacks and challenges, but they have very different views about what the future can bring. So the hallway hangers see a ladder with no rungs on it, or at least none they can reach. They believe that the educational system cannot deliver on its promise of upward social mobility for those who perform well in school. By contrast, he says, the brothers are achievement-oriented. They price accomplishments in school and obedience to the law and measure success as does the rest of society. The ethos of their group encourages high aspirations and reinforces behavior that contributes to the realization of their goals. So what's interesting for McLeod is that they arrive at such different views of what the future holds, but also that there's this interesting dynamic in each of the groups where they reinforce each other's views of the future. So the hallway hangers tend to talk to each other, share this kind of more pessimistic view about what the future holds, and reinforce that in each other. And the brothers similarly reinforces more positive aspirational view of what the future holds. And there's interesting dynamics that have to do also with race here. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. But you might think, well, this kind of shows that you can look at a similar situation and come to very different interpretations of what's going on. That's part of it. I think another part of it is that your peer group can have a really strong effect on one interpretation. But the reason that I bring this up and this example is that it also shows us the limits of how much interpretation and kind of positive optimistic beliefs can have. So McLeod returns to the Clarendon Heights projects a couple of times over his lifetime. He returns, I think it's 8 years later. And what he finds is that actually the trajectories of these two groups are not that different at that point. Many of them are stuck in kind of like low-income work or out of work. They are experiencing housing instability and all sorts of other kind of precarity in their lives. And then he returns, I think it's 15 years later, and there the picture is a little bit more optimistic for the brothers. It does seem like they do manage to secure a more stable foothold in the lower middle class than the hallway hangers. But the differences are not as great as their own aspirational pictures when they were high school kids would imply, right? So, and I think what this shows us is that there are social structural limits, right, in place. And that when we ignore them and focus too keenly on this idea of striving and perseverance, we might miss that people's opportunities really can be limited by the social structures on which they're in. And so I wanted to bring this up just to say that even though we're interested in thinking through the striving agent's perspective, it's also important to keep in mind that these social structures that are in the background can be quite limiting, even if you manage to be the optimist who has this positive interpretation of the evidence in front of you. There are, I think, some gains that you see in the McLeod when he goes back to this housing project, but it's not dramatic in the way that these two, that he thought would be the future given where these two groups are when he talks to them in high school. Okay, so let me turn now to some thoughts about cultivating breakthrough solidarity now that we kind of keep in mind these background social structures that are there. In my other work on first generation college students and the kind of sacrifices that they make to pursue higher education, which is a central case of striving that's informed my thinking, one thing that has been striking is that we know that one of the interventions that best works to keep students in college and not dropping out, which is a risk for first generation college students, is what gets called a cohort model, which is basically groups of first generation college students being put together. I don't know if UCSC has something like this, but there are various institutions that have these summer programs where first generation low income students will come to campus before the semester starts. They will talk about the challenges they face, they will form friendships, they will connect with each other. And this kind of model of putting groups together and helping people overcome helping people pursue goals that are ambitious and where success is not assured is actually a common thing if you think about it. There's like women in engineering, women in philosophy, right? Students of color in philosophy, math, and so on. And so I always it's kind of puzzling, what is it about these kind of groups? What are they doing for us, right? And there's one model that you might think about, which is very much in line with the temptation model, which is that what groups do is give you extra motivation to overcome the temptation to quit by adding a kind of accountability. So think about the exercise case, right? You're trying to be the person that exercises every day. One way of keeping you on track is to find what people call an accountability partner. Someone else that you're exercising with, right? Some of you might have done that. And the thought there is that basically now your motivation to get up at 5 a.m. to go for a run is not just that you want to run a marathon or be healthy or exercise every day. It's that now you owe it to this person who's also getting up at 5 a.m. to go for a run, and you kind of like bolster your motivation that way. So that's one kind of model. But I don't think that that model works particularly well for the kind of first generation college student case or the women in physics case. It seems like in those cases you don't go to the first gen low income group to like bolster each other's accountability by promising to each other that like, you're not going to quit college and we're going to. I don't think that that's the right model. But I think a good model for thinking about that is a kind of epistemic solidarity. So I think that part of what we're doing in those cases and helping us succeed and strive is that we're finding others who are similarly situated with respect to a challenge in order to get these additional perspectives and get a better handle on how to interpret the obstacles in front of you. So one of the things that talking to other people who are overcoming similar challenges can do is that you're basically pulling epistemic resources. So say I'm bring an example from my own life. My first year in college, I thought I was going to major in math. I got placed into this class called real analysis. As this is my first college math class. I was like, had no idea what was going on. I was so lost. I'm a first generation college student, so I can call my family and help them figure out. I thought I was good at math until I got to that class. I ended up dropping out of that class. But I think what happens and at the time we didn't have this like first in group, first general income, all of this infrastructure didn't exist. But I think one thing that could have happened, which I found out later, is that nobody had any idea what was happening in this class. The professor was a notoriously terrible teacher, but a well-renowned mathematician. And the thing that would have helped was realizing that, right? That this interpretation I had of the setback or challenge was that I just didn't have what it takes to succeed at math or in this math class. But if I had talked to other people who were similar in position, I'm going to figure it out like, actually that was not the right conclusion to draw from this bit of evidence. There was something else going on. And I think that's often what turning to other people who are facing similar challenges can do. You can sort of try to figure out, what is the challenge here? Is it that I don't have what it takes? Or is it a feature of the situation, or the teacher, or something else that might guard against that kind of premature despair when you're the person that just looks at the setback and you think, nope, I don't have what it takes, I'm just going to quit. So there's a kind of epistemic solidarity that I think also bolsters our capacity to keep striving by helping us reinterpret and consider multiple perspectives on the situation in front of you. Okay, so I'm going to be in here. So cultivating grit is not just a matter of forcing yourself to persevere no matter what. We argue that we need a new picture of strength of will for striving agents. On our view, the striving agent is one that is paying attention to the evidence of how conducive to success her context is, whether she has what it takes, and what success looks like. She is talking to others to find out how they see her situation. She's considering the problems and challenges she faces from different perspectives. And she's open to the possibility that failure can be costly, but she doesn't give up too soon. The strength of the striving agent comes not from persevering come what may, but from being attuned to this delicate balance she needs to strike between premature despair and costly failure. And critically, you can be better attuned to this balance by being attentive to how things look to you, but also to incorporating the perspective of others, whether it's teachers or mentors or people who are in a similar position to you. And so we think that this is potentially a more fruitful way to think about striving that thinks about striving beyond just like the individual agent, persevering, and has this potential social dimension. And that's all I want to say. Thank you so much.
Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. So we're just going to take a 10-minute